Always technical aspects. I'll start again. Hi, I'm Alan Donsky. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for taking some time out for yourself this evening. It's beautiful weather. And on behalf of Wellness Through Mindfulness, I want to welcome you here tonight. We are a group that started up in 2015. And the purpose of our group, Wellness Through Mindfulness, was to freely offer programs of mindfulness to the community at large and on mindfulness and related topics with lots of talented speakers from Calgary. We have a website called The Breath Project that also supports Wellness Through Mindfulness. You will find a range of videos, talks, and informative resources there. You can also link to the Wellness Through Mindfulness website at WTM, thebreathproject.org, and see summaries of previous talks, guided meditations, and recordings of previous talks. I'd like to thank the Calgary Public Library, with whom we've partnered since we went virtual, and specifically Patrick Mealy for the initial invitation, and one of our frequent co-hosts and collaborators who's on this evening, Maya Milovich. We offer Zoom presentations twice a month on an ongoing basis, every second and fourth Thursday. First and third Thursday of the month. And in regards to that, I would just like to advise you of our upcoming presentations, which are on our website. On Thursday, March the 3rd, there's a talk by Dr. Leslie Ellistat on the mindful connection to the beautiful. Mindfulness, we often think only as somehow getting through difficult things, but it's a doorway also to the beautiful. And that should be an enlightening and nourishing conversation. On Thursday, March 17th, we've got Mindfulness for the Overthinker, and that's being presented by Nicole Libben, another wonderful mindfulness practitioner who is a wonderful speaker and very enthusiastic, and I encourage you to look up more information on those. I'd like to remind you that you can type questions. I'll be keeping an eye out in the chat room for you through the course of the evening, and we'll address the questions at the end. And also just I want to put in a small plea that we used to collect small donations of any kind in a basket when we did meet in person before COVID. And so please feel free, if you are so inclined, to offer even a few small dollars into the donation link on our website. We do have ongoing expenses. None of the speakers are paid in any way for this, but it does help us with keeping up the website and other technical aspects. With that housekeeping in mind, I'd just like to move ahead to introducing Phil Bluestein, a colleague and friend of mine. Phil was a gastroenterologist for many, many years, and it's a medical specialty that specializes in the stomach and the gastrointestinal disorders. He believed and realized strongly in the impact of stress in contributing to many of the symptoms that he was faced with when seeing his patients. He created the website www.thebreathproject.org for his patients to help them work with anxiety. The website, as mentioned, also contains multiple videos, meditations, talks from experts, and other resources. He wrote a book called Mindfulness Medication, a physician's prescription for stress relief. This book is available as a free download from the website, or can be bought if you want a copy. He helped create and still supports and is the key mover and motivator and enthusiast for the work that we do here through the community. This evening's topic is an interesting one, and the title grabbed me for sure: Gratitude, Negatude, or Alltitude. And this is really how to create appreciation for what we perceive as both positive and negative emotions and experiences. And mindfulness can help us establish a skillful relationship with the present moment. Phil will also be touching on the topic, which has come up in the last couple of years, of post-traumatic growth as an idea that from our trauma or from difficulties or suffering, if we work it and work with it mindfully, we can actually grow and flourish on the other side of difficulties. So following that relatively long introduction, Phil, it's a pleasure to bring you on. And thank you very much for your contributions tonight.
Well, thanks, Alan. I really appreciate your kind words and Maya's ongoing great help. So I'm Phil Bluestein, and like you, I am human. I suffer, and I have never liked it. I was a gastroenterologist for 39 years and learned daily from the suffering of my patients. I've had a contemplative practice for 25 years. I have deliberately made an effort to try and deal more effectively with my suffering. And tonight, what I would like to offer you is what I have learned from this practice. I'd like to share what I have learned from my practice about what is suffering, why do we suffer, what can we learn from it, and importantly, how can we be in a skillful relationship with it. What I plan to talk about is applicable for most of our everyday pain and suffering, bearing in mind that people who have significant depression or trauma may obviously require formal psychological therapy and medications. So let's explore this topic. Number one, bad things happen. The first noble truth of the Buddha has been defined as life is suffering. So when you hear that, uh, how does that make you feel? How do you resonate with that? Is that something that you say, yeah, I get it, I understand it, and I live my life from that truth? Or do you hear the words, but you really don't want to go there? It's just too uncomfortable to face the fact that I suffer. I'd much rather just put it off. Hopefully it'll never come and I'll never have to deal with it. Well, we as humans have a very infantile, naive, and delusional belief. A belief that only good things should happen to me, that life is predictable, and that life is controllable. I'd like you to reflect on these statistics. 40 to 50% of first marriages, 67% of second marriages, and 73% of third marriages end in divorce. 50% of Canadians will have cancer, and 25% will die of that disease. 30% of us who retire will have no retirement savings. 30% of all women age 15 and older will be sexually assaulted at least once. And death rates remain steadfast at 100%. Is there suffering in life? It seems kind of obvious. I'd invite you to do this visualization exercise, but bear in mind that if bringing to mind a memory of some trauma, some discomfort might re-traumatize you, then just skip this meditation. So just close your eyes. And if you could just imagine someone you know and care for has died. That an important relationship has changed unfavorably and ended. Or you might experience some psychological or medical ill health. And now reflect on the fact that you will die, and it can occur in any moment. As upsetting as these reflections are, They are essential to remind us of the true nature of life. I believe that we need to ponder, to reflect on a regular basis until they become embedded in our psyche and we live our life from this truth. It is through this reflection that we may actually get a greater appreciation of life. And it will prepare you for the inevitable. I think that we need to try and create a formal meditation practice of reflecting on our own mortality and morbidity. 2 years ago, my mother died. She was 100 years old. And in the last several years before she died, it became quite obvious that she was going to die sooner than later. And I made a deliberate practice to reflect on the fact that she was going to die soon. I read books. I went to meditation retreats on death and dying. And there's no question that when she died, I was better prepared to deal with her death. But even more importantly, I was able to appreciate her as she was alive prior to her death. The Buddhists have a practice on death. And in my meditation room, I have a skeleton. Before I meditate, I look up at that skeleton and I say, you know what? That's how I am going to end up. It is a potent reminder to me every day that I may die this day, but it is a very potent reminder to me that I better appreciate today, because I have no guarantee there will be another day. That in contemplating death, there is a greater appreciation of life. So the first important point is the recognition that pain and suffering is normal and to be expected. Number 2, all experience changes and is impermanent. So what happened with that great happiness you had when you got your new iPhone, your new car, your new house, your new partner? Do you still have that high that you had when that first happened? And what about that profound sadness that you had when someone you died, when someone you cared for died, or there was an end of a relationship that was really important to you? Is that terrible sadness still present? The reality is that the high and lows we experience in life tend to slowly fade and change over time. That we habituate to our experience. So the question is, why is that? Why do we adapt to what we experience in life? Brickman and Campbell in 1971 introduced this concept of habitual adaptation that we now know as the Hedonic Treadmill. The theory states that whether you have an event that causes happiness or sadness, you will eventually return back to your baseline level of happiness. They studied people who won significant amount of money in lotteries and people who unfortunately developed traumatic paraplegia and quadriplegia. And interestingly, over time, both of these groups were equally happy. Sonia Lyubomirsky, in her book, The How of Happiness, states that everyone has a defined set point of how happy they are. And this is instrumental in determining our happiness in 50% of the time. 40% from our thoughts, our actions, 10% from external circumstances. So the point is, we quickly become habituated to new situations. From an evolutionary perspective, this may reflect the fact that we as humans have what is called negative bias. In other words, we are constantly surveilling our environment for what is potentially a threat, what is potentially negative to us, as opposed to what is potentially positive and beneficial. If we become too complacent, too content with what we have in our life, we lose that capacity to be alert and to be aware. So becoming habituated is a survival technique. Habituation to our pain and suffering may also reflect the fact that with time, one becomes removed from that original trauma and the intensity diminishes. And with time, there is also the capacity of context. Can we look back at what has happened and see it from a different perspective? Can we reinterpret it? So following that divorce, one has the opportunity to recognize, you know what? Maybe it wasn't all because of my partner. And it gives you a chance to really begin to look at yourself, examine yourself. What did you do that contributed to the breakdown of this relationship? And how can you act on what you discover that makes the next relationship even better and more meaningful? And you lose your job. Maybe this is an opportunity to reevaluate. Are you in the job because this is something that you were ingrained to do? Or is there a passion that you really need to follow? Suffering is a reminder for one to be patient, to allow time, context, and perspective to be able to view our suffering from a different light. That perhaps suffering doesn't dissolve, but maybe it evolves. So one can see how we are in relationship with our suffering and how that will change. We have fear that good things won't last and bad things will last. We have the desire that good things will last and bad things won't last. But the reality is that it is the nature of all experience to change and end. That in any moment is the potential for happiness and suffering to arise. That can we see that in any moment what is intact is already potentially broken, and what is broken is already potentially whole. That can we come to life, to our experience, and see that we are happy and not yet happy, that we are sad and not yet sad, and that we are dead and not yet dead. That we can see that everything has the potential for change. So, number 2, it is important to recognize that it is the nature of all experience to change and end. And that it is when we try to hold on to experience to be a certain way, we will definitely suffer. Number 3. So why do we suffer? People say, why has my father, my partner, my son, me, had this misfortune? This is just not fair. There are so many people in this world who behave so much worse than I do. And why are they free of suffering? It is a misguided false belief that we have the capacity to control circumstances in our life. In fact, it is hubris to believe that we should be exempt from suffering that the rest of the world will experience. It is a fallacy to believe that bad things happen because it is destiny. That this is not retribution for unskillful action. The reality is that there is no answer to the mystery of life. Suffering happens. And perhaps we should rephrase the question from why we suffer to why not. External things happen that are beyond our control. Natural disasters, COVID, death, tragic accidents. And we also believe that we are responsible for our suffering through the conscious choices and actions that we make. So let us examine, how does suffering come about? Number one, Buddhism would say that suffering arises from the fact that there is a desire for things to be different from the way they are. There is always a resistance. We live our life from a place of constantly wanting change, that the present moment is never good enough. So reflect. Do you live your life from the perspective of if only? If only I had a better job, a better partner, better health, better friends, better kids, then I would be much happier. We are always searching for what we believe we don't have. We are constantly trying to fill up our perceived deficiencies rather than celebrating our abundances. We fantasize that what we are going to get is so much better than what we have. But let's be honest. There is no guarantee that any of this will ever come to reality. And there is no guarantee that even if it does, it's going to be as great as you believe it will be. We assume that change is going to make us better. So reflect. How did that new job, that new relationship, that new exercise program, that new diet work for you? Are you still doing it? Is it better than what you had before? So why are we in resistance to what we experience? The Buddha further explains, pain is expected, suffering is optional. This is an essential point in understanding suffering. Pain is expected, suffering is optional. There is no question that there is this initial pain of what we experience, the loss, the misfortune, the ill health. But the real problem is not what happens, but what we do with it. Value is not inherent to what we experience. It comes from our interpretation of the experience that causes our suffering. We're walking down the street. We see a friend across the street. They don't acknowledge us. They don't say hi. I feel hurt. I feel rejected. But maybe the friend just didn't see you. You get into an argument with your partner and you immediately feel rejected and unloved. Your partner, on the other hand, sees it as just a matter of a difference of opinion. You are living from the place of your childhood when you felt unsafe and unloved because of your relationship with your parents. That every moment we experience is referenced against our personal, arbitrary, conditioned belief system that represents who we are and how we should behave in the moment. Have we acted in a way that agrees or disagrees with who we believe we are? Then we judge ourselves. And where does this belief system come from? Well, predominantly it reflects our relationship with our caregivers, our need to feel safe and loved and worthy. Everyone has some belief that they are not good enough, that every moment, every experience is interpreted against the belief, does this make me feel good or bad? And in reaction to our interpretation, we then act with our characteristic coping strategy. It could be one of security, safety, fear, inadequacy, defensiveness, aggressiveness. The way we act impacts all our relationships and their outcome. We live our life defined and limited by our personal narrative. The problem is that this narrative and the coping strategies that were pretty effective when we are young have passed their best before date. So it is critical to recognize that our minds have a mind of their own, that they are constantly, autonomously, meaning under their control, and subconsciously, meaning we're not aware of it, evaluating our experience moment to moment, and then allowing us to be conscious of it. So the reality is that conventionally, we are just the witness, not the orchestrator of what we think and how we act. Bear in mind that I am not saying that the outcome is inevitable because of the way our mind works. What I am saying is that we contribute to the possibility of the outcome of our relationships because of our habitual conditioning. That it is important that we don't blame and judge ourselves for who we are. We didn't choose our conditioning. And that the intentionality of all our action as it relates to who we are is skillful because it's meant to keep us safe, loved, and worthy. The problem is that the action of our intentionality for self and other may not be skillful, and for that we are responsible. Free will? I'm not so sure. Number 3, the Buddha goes on to say that anything we attach to as I, me, or mine leads to suffering. In other words, we can give meaning, we can interpret the event, but the critical aspect is, do we attach to it? And this is what determines the suffering. So what is it that you are attaching to? Is it the object of your desire or avoidance? Or reflect. What is it that desires or avoids? It's our sense of self. So the ultimate attachment that causes our suffering is not the object of our attachment, but it is the sense of self that attaches to the object. It's when we identify with the sense of self that we take ownership of the suffering that the self has. Number 4. So what is the key to freedom? If we can rest in the awareness that knows the experience that contains the story of self, rather than be the sense of self that believes it is having the experience, we will not suffer. Can we rest in awareness and not self? As we have seen, we create a sense of self moment to moment dependent upon the circumstances. So why identify with anything that is temporary, that is ephemeral, and that is conditioned? We have this magical potentiality of mindfulness that is the key to freedom, and that it is through mindfulness that we can bring awareness to what is happening, discernment and insight into the true nature of reality, the ability to non-attach with sense of self, and the capacity to choose a skillful action. So in summary, suffering results from 1, the desire for things to be different than the way they are. 2, interpretation of the experience against our held belief system. And 3, attachment to our sense of self. Freedom, mindfulness. Number 4, is there meaning to suffering? Pain has a purpose. So consider physical pain. You break your leg. Do you walk on it? You vomit. Do you eat? You're tired. Do you sleep? Physical pain is calling for us to examine what is in pain and trying to figure out what is the problem. Our psychological pain is no different. It is a calling to bring our attention, what needs our attention in the moment. So what is our mental suffering trying to tell us? Well, it may be as basic as our biologic drive saying what is being experienced is a potential threat to our existence. It may be pointing to a perceived problem from an adult perspective. For example, there is a loss of a loved one. They may have died, the relationship may have ended. So is this just grief? Or are there other factors that are calling to be heard in the moment? Perhaps there is a fear of now having to be alone. Perhaps there was a dependency on the partner for financial support, and now there's fear. What am I going to do? The partner took care of all the problems in the house, the computer, the car, anything that was broken. Oh my God, I lost my handyman. The partner was the caretaker, did the cooking, did the cleaning. I've lost that. I've lost my sexual partner. Or the partner was responsible as the parent. And now the concern is, what am I going to do with these kids? The reality is that when something happens, it's important to look for the intentionality for why you are suffering as a way to bring clarity to what needs to be addressed. And finally, if we dig deeper, we come to the essence of our suffering. That is our core belief system about who we believe we are and how we should behave in this world. Suffering is asking us to examine what is our unmet psychological need. What is our inner child wounding calling in this moment that needs to be addressed? So, can we allow suffering to be our cue, our signal to reflect on what is calling to be heard? Can we begin to look at the intentionality that may be multifactorial? Can we view suffering as an opportunity for discovery? Number 5, happiness is dependent on our relationship with the experience. Our normal relationship with what we don't like is resistance. We call this experiential avoidance. The problem with experiential avoidance is, although it may be the commonest way we try and cope with our suffering, it is also the commonest way we amplify and sustain our suffering. Why? Because we never take the time to turn towards, to examine, to embrace, to discover why we suffer. Carl Jung said, "What you resist not only persists, but it will grow in size." We falsely believe that we have the ability to change what has happened. We deceive ourselves. As Shakespeare says in Macbeth, "What's done cannot be undone." The only thing we can change is our relationship with our suffering. And the way to do that is with mindfulness. Because mindfulness is asking us to be in relationship with our present moment experience with acceptance. Now, this doesn't mean approval, but this means opening, allowing, understanding, and integrating. Mindfulness is asking us to be in relationship with the present moment through engaged embodiment, to be present through our bodies. The problem is that when we get stressed out and our mind goes off, there's no way we can talk to our minds. Our thinking mind goes offline. We resort to a primitive, early reptilian brain. Fight, flight, or freeze. And the only way you can communicate is through your body. It's very interesting. Even before we had language, when we experienced trauma, that trauma would be expressed through our body. But unfortunately, we have always been in resistance to the trauma held in our body. It never has had the opportunity to freely move, be expressed, and come to completion. When you're upset, what do you want? You want someone who can be there with you, who can listen to you, who can hold you, who can support you. You don't want somebody who's going to necessarily give you an answer. Well, mindfulness acts like your best friend. It is the presence of mindfulness that holds the suffering of being human and our inner child wounding. There is this implicit message that we are heard, held, honored, and hopefully healed. That we, in holding the moment without judgment or resistance, that this is transformative. This is very difficult to do. We need significant courage to stand in the face of the fire. We need to trust that there is this innate, heartfelt compassion and wisdom that can process our suffering. And that the presence of mindfulness is innately loving. That we need to step into the unknown and be open to experience whatever the present moment will unfold into. So what I'd like to share with you next is, I think, the most important part of this presentation. I want to share with you a strategy to be present in an embodied way with your suffering. That is the key to a skillful relationship. We live a disembodied experience. We live in our heads. The purpose of our body is to support our head. It's insane. Number one, The first thing as it relates to engaged embodiment is we need to deliberately focus our awareness into the physical sensations of our body, both the somatic and the visceral sense that is present. We need to move out of our heads. Number 2, when under stress, you need to do a quick body scan. Bring your awareness to the soles of your feet and then quickly rise up to the top of your head. Where do you feel the maximal tension located? Just notate it. Where does it exist? Where is it located? Number 3, we need to stabilize our dysregulated nervous system. When we're really stressed, when we're reacting to our suffering, we are out of control. And we need to stabilize that dysregulated area. And so what we need to do is to bring attention to the neutral part of our body. You see, most of our tension is held in our face and our torso. The neutral parts of our body in the presence of suffering is in the periphery. Our feet, our buttocks, our hands. We need to consciously find the area that resonates most for us. We need to rest in those sensations until there is a sense of settling and groundedness. And sometimes it may be helpful to accentuate those sensations by either rubbing our hands together, our buttocks on the chair, or our feet into the ground. When you feel stabilized, number 4, you then begin to bring your awareness from your place of groundedness to as close as you can get to the maximum place of discomfort physically. Bear in mind that you may not get to that place, that it may be just too uncomfortable, and that's perfectly fine. Get as close as you can without it causing difficulty. Because you have to bear in mind, you see, the problem in getting to the hot spot is that that is where we are holding our historic trauma. And as we get close to it, we are stepping really into the fire of the trauma. And that once you've come up to this point, if it gets too uncomfortable, one may then need to go back to the place of groundedness. There may be this element of oscillation, or as Peter Levine describes it, pendulation, where you come up, get as close as you can, stay there. If it gets too hot, move down. If you can stay, great. Over time, there is the capacity for us to stay longer and to move closer. Because, as I said, the ultimate purpose in having engaged embodiment is to allow for the release of the historic trauma held in our bodies. Using your breath may also be very helpful in this engaged embodiment. One takes a conscious, deep, slow breath. One inhales from the belly so that there is diaphragmatic breathing. And one prolongs the exhalation such that you are breathing out 1 second longer than you breathe in. And the reason why we do this is because it helps to stimulate what is called the parasympathetic component of our autonomic nervous system that promotes relaxation. Embodiment can sometimes be done in the moment. Sometimes we're just too overwhelmed and we can't. And so what you can do is later on, when there is some degree of stability, privacy, time, you can relive that moment and then try and embody the experience. the most important thing you can do with your suffering is to move from beyond experiential avoidance, denial, running away of the experience, to engaged embodiment, where you are turning towards, where you face and then embrace your suffering. Number 6, what can we learn from our suffering? Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun described post-traumatic growth in 1999. It's not the effect that we are suffering, but it is the response in trying to deal with the suffering, a significant degree of suffering that allows for psychological growth to occur. That this post-traumatic growth can never occur in the setting of experiential avoidance. That the positive change that occurs can be reflected with a greater appreciation for life, greater compassion and altruism, more skillful relationships, a greater sense of purpose and meaning, and a deeper spiritual life. That can we learn from our suffering how to be better prepared in the future to prevent and deal with what arises? Can we identify what are the triggers to our suffering? And can we develop emotional resilience to allow us to be with the suffering? And can suffering also allow us to examine what is the purpose in our life? Is it just happiness in obtaining external objects and life events? Or is there this contentment, this capacity to rejoice in what it is to be human and alive? Or to appreciate what is the meaning that you have in your life? And can you honor that innate gift that is calling to live through you? I like to close this discussion and share with you a personal suffering that I had that was very meaningful and very informative. As I mentioned, my mother died 2 years ago. And as I was leaving the funeral, I was again overcome with just this profound sadness and grief and sense of loss. And in that moment, there was this voice in my head that said, turn towards it. And spontaneously, there was just this sense of feeling what the sadness was. And there was just this knowing of what the sadness was, without any sense of self that was suffering or knowing the suffering. It was simply a complete embodiment of the experience. It was a knowing of the experience. It was a unification. It was an intimacy with it. There was a curiosity of what does suffering feel like? There was nothing to do. It was being done. And there was just this trust of allowing things to be present and to unfold. There was no fear or resistance. The moment passed, and there was just this sense of relief, of letting go. And in that moment, I remember myself thinking, I hope I can die like this. That capacity to be present with whatever my experience was, whatever the nature of the suffering was, and to simply hold it and be open to it without resistance. I would love to be able to call upon this as needed, but I'm not able to. But what I've recognized is that when it has occurred has been at times of profound sadness. And I truly believe that it was my mindfulness and meditation practice that created the conditions to allow this to happen. That voice in my head that said, turn towards it, really speaks to mindfulness. And I would suggest that you sincerely and diligently practice mindfulness and meditation, because you never know what gift will be given to you. And so with that, I like to end our presentation, and I will turn this over to Alan.
Thank you, Phil. As moderator, I'd just like to invite us just to have a few moments with ourselves as we drop in, and to use Phil's embodiment just for a minute or two to just see what pieces of suffering, which may be huge loss, or perhaps it's just a sense of uneasiness, and just to come into your body right now with what Phil suggested. Where does that tension, suffering, pain live? Where is it embodied? To become aware, it's often somewhere in our head, or tension, or clenching jaw, or chest, or tummy. And yet there are other parts of the body which are more at ease. And noticing how these things are in relation to each other. Taking a longer breath, prolonging that out breath, as Phil suggested, engages our parasympathetic nervous system. And the intention, as Phil said, is just to be with it. We're not trying to fix it. We're not trying to manage it. We're not trying to make it go away. We don't need to judge it. In this moment, we watch it change. We watch our relationship with it change, as Phil said. And we come into being with it. And we ease with it. And one of the things Phil said, and I'm sort of summarizing a wonderful talk, thank you, Phil, that when we're just with it, we actually become more intimate with it. And when we're more intimate with it, now I can work with it. I can dance with it. And this, of course, is very important. It's another way of saying exactly what Phil said, which is that our tendency to avoid the yucky stuff, we push it away. We have an aversion. And of course, when I'm distanced from it, I'm not in relationship with it. So how can I work with it? And what we're trying to do there is sort of split off part of ourselves, which we can't do because it's there. Phil's awareness of his tremendous sadness at his mom's funeral. And just to be with it. And in that being with it, we realize that perhaps it's not going to overwhelm us. That it's actually part of who we are. It's a recognition of the fullness of our humanity. And it's about changing our relationship with it. I want to make a comment and then I'll come to, and stay with the experience as we enter our conversation path this evening and interaction and chat room and so forth. Viktor Frankl, who survived a number of Nazi death camps, wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning. And what he came up with was the fact that there's no academic intellectual meaning. And what he discovered was that we bring meaning to any situation. What does this pain mean based on what Phil said? And just underscoring Phil's talk, that we bring a story, the neighbor across the road or friend who didn't wave, we think it means they don't want to talk to us or I've hurt them. So meaning is not inherent in anything, it's our relationship to it. And this ties into, and I'm going to go into a question in the question room, Phil. How can we use this approach to manage physical pain, Phil?
Well, that's a great question. And I think it really comes back to that essential point that pain is expected and suffering is optional. So there's no question that we have physical pain and it hurts, and that is not going to go away. It may change over time, you may get treatment for it, but the reality is, again, what do we do with our experience? What is the meaning that we give to it? And so one of the big problems we have when we try, for example, and I'll get back to the physical aspect, but part of the problem we have when dealing with pain is that pain doesn't exist independent of our story around it. So it can be very difficult sometimes to strip the two apart. The physicality of the pain and what it means. So when we have a thought of fear or of sadness, there is a physical component that goes along with that our thoughts, our feelings, and our physical pain are all interconnected, and one is not expressed independently of the other two. So part of the problem when we do embodiment as an exercise, when we deal with suffering, is that we can feel the physical pain, but it is the associated emotional component that makes us run away. And so this is no different than with the physical pain that we experience. Primary physical pain that then has a secondary emotional component. People would come and see me in my office when I was a gastroenterologist. I have abdominal pain. What does this mean? Do I have cancer? Am I going to die? Will the pain get worse? How will I ever cope? So you can see that there is the physicality and what we do with it. And so I think it's important to recognize the two, to look for the interpretation. And three is, in some way, can you just focus on the physicality of the pain? And the way you can do that is to really focus on it as a physical pain by asking yourself these questions. Where is the pain located? How does it feel? Are there boundaries to it? Does it change? What is its shape? What is its color? So, bear in mind that things do not exist independently, that thoughts, feelings, and physicality are related, and that in some way, can you strip the physicality from the emotionality?
If I can add here, We also, watching our language about ourselves is also important, because that speaks to what Phil said about the relationship to it. So we often say, and the question was, had the word manage. How do I manage physical pain? Now, the word manage has subtle implications of I'm the manager, I'm the boss. We're now into the boss, we're now into controlling, we're now trying to get certain preconceived outcomes. I want it to go away. And now we see how the whole story comes. So even in the questions that we ask ourselves, how do we manage it? And as a therapist, I would often say to people, what's your relationship to your pain? Are you fighting it? Are you resisting it? Of course you want it to go away. Of course you want it to be minimized. What's your understanding of the cause of the pain? And at most pain clinics, patients spend more time talking about their relationship to the pain than they do about the condition itself. Because when people are referred to a pain clinic, the medical system, the painkillers or the physiotherapy or the massage or whatever, has reached what it can do. And what's left is this very important piece that Phil talks about, the suffering about the pain, which is the story. So mindfulness is often a very key component to helping people change their relationship with pain. And I'll relate a personal story. It's about a decade ago, I was woken at about 2 hours after falling asleep by this pain in my lower tummy. Initially, I thought it was a gut problem. And then I realized that the pain had started just around my back and it was coming around the front. And suddenly I remembered it was the middle of summer and I may not have drunk very much. And my father also had kidney stones. And I said, whoops, I've got a kidney stone. I went to the hospital. There's a wait as usual. And I was in a gurney in the waiting room. I was fairly sure about the diagnosis. There weren't any other symptoms. And I had an hour and a half of the most intense mindful practice I could ever have, because there wasn't a bed for the nursing staff to put me into, to put up the IV and give me some Toradol and fluids and so forth. And I knew these waves were going to come, and it's the worst pain that I've ever had. And I knew the waves were going to come. And I had this opportunity to practice this intense being with the pain without demonizing it, without criticizing it, because the pain and the cramps is my body's way of trying to get rid of the stone as it was passing down from the kidney to the bladder, that muscle. And so I had this opportunity to practice. And what it did was it brought my relationship to it, this inevitability that this too will pass. Here it comes in spasms, it's going to go. And I said, oh, wow. And so I had this opportunity to really practice the mindfulness. Because if I'd wished it to go away, if I'd have got angry at the hospital system for not fixing it right now, and why don't you give me a shot of something while I'm lying in the gurney in the waiting room, and how dare it, and why don't the politicians make the wait time? I could have added all these layers of suffering to what was just the pain. And I actually, to come to a word in Phil's topic for tonight, gratitude, I was actually grateful that my body was capable of trying to expel the stone. I was grateful my body was working correctly and doing what it was designed to do. I came to actually value the wonder and the altitude and the awe of this. I hope I'm not giving the impression that I'm being just positive thinking and you haven't heard me say anything about pretending this wasn't the most painful hour and a half of my life physically. It was, but changing my relationship at the end was wonderful.
So I want to add one other thing, and I think
Yeah,
it's
sure.
might be an opportunity for us to talk about this key component of relationship, and that is it is mindfulness that is allowing us to have relationship. You know, our classic definition of mindfulness stems from Jon Kabat-Zinn's awareness of the present moment on purpose in a particular way with acceptance and non-judgmentally. That in our modern iteration of mindfulness, we think of it as enhanced awareness and non-reactivity. But the reality is there are multiple definitions to mindfulness. And Jon Kabat-Zinn's definition of mindfulness was significantly influenced by his Korean Zen Buddhist Mahayana Buddhist tradition. Historic Buddhism looked at mindfulness as a way of determining whether what is present is skillful and how to act in a skillful way. So I think that it's important that we understand from this perspective what mindfulness is, because ultimately there is always a component of reaction to whatever we experience. Mindfulness is just giving us the time to engage and embody the experience and give us the time to then choose how we will respond skillfully. It's very interesting when we embody our experience, because what we do, you know, do you have a mind that criticizes, compares, and judges you? I certainly do. But the beauty of mindfulness is that there's nothing to do, that things change by allowing them to remain the same. That in understanding that what this mind is telling me and why it's telling me, it's just a knowing of what is being created. And in the end, there's nothing to do with it. I'd like to make one last important aspect about this relationship. This is not relationship with, in the sense, I am scared, I am angry, I am sad. And people will say, well, just let go of the anger, of the pain, of the sadness. That's not what it's about. The question is, what is angry? What is sad? What is fearful? It's our sense of self. And we don't realize that we can either rest in the sense of self, or we can rest in awareness that knows there is a sense of self. That a skillful relationship is not with the object that we want or don't want. The essence of a skillful relationship in mindfulness is our relationship with the sense of self. That the essence of mindfulness is the capacity to not identify and own the self, but to know that it is something that has been created in the moment that serves a purpose, that it is a functional, utilitarian tool for us to be in and act in the world. But the freedom of mindfulness is the capacity to rest in knowing there is a self, but not being the self.
That space that you speak of there, Phil, it reminds me as well. It's just another way of saying the same thing. And because our tendency is to avoid pain. I don't want the yucky stuff, give me more of the yummy stuff. We need to remember that unpleasant stuff, yucky stuff, negative feelings, stuff we don't want actually has very important messages if we lean into them. If I'm outside on Sunday night when it's going to be minus 22 in shorts and a t-shirt and I start shivering and my nose goes numb, that shivering and numbness is telling me to get warm if I listen to the unpleasant. Hunger invites me to find food. Grief and loss reminds me of the value of cherished, loving, nourishing relationships. So if I didn't love in the first place, I wouldn't have grief. So these things are always in relation to each other. And if we lean into them and ask, what is the suffering wanting of me? That's where what Phil says comes in. It's another way of I'm leaning in it, I'm with it, and what can I get from this? Rather than trying to push it away because I missed the opportunity. So I have a friend who, I know a number of people who have lost pets, for example. And they say, I don't want to get another pet. It was too painful when my last pet died. And so we can try and avoid the pain by not getting another pet. We're also depriving ourselves of a decade or 15 years or 20 years in the case of a long-lived cat, of the joy of being in relation. Will it end? Yes, of course. So we can't be happy avoiding life. You'll never be happy avoiding life, because when we pull away from ourselves, we pull away from everything. We dissociate. We deny and minimize parts of ourselves. So mindfulness and what Phil's talking about here is embracing it all, the altitude and the negatude. And I've heard you say on a few occasions, and I think about the gratitude. The word gratitude is related to the word gratis, which is also free, right? Something's gratis and free in the German. And Phil says mindfulness is the freedom to be with something. We often think of freedom as freedom from something. But Phil, I've heard you say so often, and I think about it. It's the mindfulness is the freedom to be with it. Because in that being with it, now I can work with it, whether it's a physical pain, whether it's a grief, whether it's shivering in the blizzard. There's just no way we can put up parts of ourselves. I want to highlight something else Phil said. This is not to say that mindfulness can be the only tool for tremendous post-traumatic stress, for suffering, for flashbacks or dissociation from people who've gone through severe trauma and abuse. Because often that exposure is just too overwhelming. The ego, the body react, all of that. And that's why for the folks who are deeply traumatized, mindfulness, you can't spiritually bypass this. You can't emotionally bypass this. And so that if someone has deep trauma, please, we're not suggesting how that mindfulness is going to help you. There's a time for you to do stuff, and there's a time when we call in help.
Thank you, Alan.
Just a reminder, psychological safety.
So if anybody out there has any questions,
please, yeah, or comments. Yeah, it's a quiet. There are lots of people out there, and I know that.
So let me just say one thing, that
yes,
being a physician, until all the outpouring of the questions occurs, being a physician, I would tend to live in my head historically. And as I began to appreciate the importance of the body, and as I talk about this engaged embodiment, I really think it really is an essential part of the practice. And when I first started to try and get below my neck into the rest of my organism. It was a deliberate and difficult thing to do in the beginning, in that I needed to remind myself, okay, I'm scared of this and I don't like this. Okay, what am I feeling in my body? And it is a practice that we all can develop. It's a practice that requires practice. And, there's no question, I really could recognize that there was the physicality of the fluttering in my belly, but that wasn't making me scared. It was that unnamed story and those fears that went along with the fluttering that made me quickly want to leave the mind and to leave the body. And so I think that if you do this practice, wonderful. If you don't do this practice, it is a wonderful way to deal with your suffering. Be patient. It is something you need to cultivate over time. And now sometimes, I watch movies and it makes me feel uncomfortable because I'm up there on the screen and I'm feeling what they're feeling. And sometimes I deliberately say, I think I'm going to watch this movie because it's going to make me feel uncomfortable. And what a wonderful way for me to practice being in my body in the setting of discomfort. And so I think that you have to practice. It makes a difference. Because again, the important point to all of this is it's really not about trying to figure it out ultimately. I think there is a really key understanding that has been very helpful with me in understanding that it is my wounded child that is the foundation for self, that it is the wounded child that is calling to be heard in each moment. But I know my story. I don't need to try and figure it out more in the moment. Knowing that it is my wounded child that is calling, that says, I'm not loved, I'm not worthy, that I need to be perfect in order to be loved. There's another little interesting technique that you can do that allows you to embrace your uncomfortable body. And what I do is I have an image that I have cultivated, an anchoring image of my wounded child. I have a particular memory of when I was 5 or 6 years old, and there was this particular event that made me, it was quite pivotal in this sense of being loved and not feeling lovable. And I can just hear my child speak. I can hear my child feel what it did, and I can imagine what I looked like. And I have that image. That's my anchoring image. And so when I feel suffering, when I experience suffering as an attempt to allow myself to get closer to the suffering, I bring to mind the image of my wounded child. In doing that, that lets me step out of I am suffering, and it allows me in some way to help externalize it to the sense of this is my child that is suffering. And that allows compassion to be evoked within me for the child, that helps hold the wounding of the child and the suffering. You see, the problem we have in administering self-compassion is that we cannot be what offers compassion and be what needs compassion at the same time. In other words, if I am the one that's suffering, it's very difficult for this sort of presence to be able to offer suffering if we're one and the same. And so it's just this capacity to bring to mind the image of my wounded child, and that allows spontaneous compassion and the ability to hold the suffering and to hold the physicality of the suffering.
I made a comment in the chat room. I call him Little Alan. And when the woundedness comes up, I step back, as you say, Phil, create that space, and I see Little Alan from that old storying and conditioning that we've had. And I say, I've got this, buddy. It's okay. And Little Alan can feel relieved because he knows Big L is in charge now.
Ellen, there's a question for you.
Yeah.
Dr. Donsky, how did you handle the pain in the hospital? Can you give us some tips on how we can apply it to our children?
Oh, right. I'm sorry. I missed that question. And there's another question as well. For I didn't handle the pain. One of my favorite questions is when we're working with our kids, and I don't want to get into specifics here with the children, and I am a dad and I've got adult kids. When something's going on for them, when I'm seeing them in pain or confused, or I see they're suffering, that has an impact on me because I'm dad, right? And it has an impact on mom. And I say to myself, what is this? What's going on? Is this mine or is it theirs? And what's called for? This is my favorite question in any moment of discomfort. What's called for? And I can only get that answer, that wisdom Phil talks about, that intention to make a wise choice in word or deed. And the wise choice may be to just be in silence with the kid, to really listen. And in that moment, what's called for might be to just pause and co-regulate with your kid to bring them down, right? Because maybe they're upset. And if I get upset, they're going to get more upset. And we all know about co-regulation. Maybe we need to label, if it's a young kid who's 7 years old, there's more than mad, bad, glad, or sad. Maybe I need to teach them the feeling of frustration or disappointment or confusion or not knowing. We can teach our kids that everything passes, right? The excitement of their favorite ice cream store, the pain of a friend who doesn't talk to them. So in that moment, you can always ask yourself, what is this asking of me? And what's going on for the other person as an opener? And this isn't, of course, an opportunity to get into specifics, but I think the principles here are to lean into what's going on with your kid and for you to hold that space as parent and say, I wonder what's going on for them. And if you don't know, ask, how are you feeling right now, Mary or Johnny? Or, wow, I'm really feeling confused. I'm feeling really anxious. Are you feeling scared or confused? Label your feelings, model it. You know, I could go on here for a long time. I'm keeping an eye out, but Maya had a question. So Maya's question for, is it joy practicing mindfulness during happiness? And then I asked Maya to sort of expand on it.
I don't
And
get
here's what she said.
the question.
So here's Maya's response.
Okay.
Like when we have a mindful relationship with the now, we're in pain and suffering. And on the other side of the pendulum, during a mindful relationship, we're now in happiness. Are we then experiencing joy? And I'll offer a quick answer here, Maya. We often come to happiness not by finding it, but by getting rid of what makes us miserable. I'll say that again. We often come to happiness by letting go of what makes us miserable. in Phil's languaging tonight, by noticing how we're making it worse. And if we do that, we reduce the suffering from a 9 out of 10 to maybe a 3 or 4. And in that extra space we've opened up, joy will naturally arise. The gratitude will arise. We create the conditions in which joy and gratitude and compassion, another word Phil used, and forgiveness and kindness, we create the space in which they automatically come up. It's like the potato farmer doesn't grow potatoes. He creates the conditions in which the potatoes grow. So by getting rid of rid's the wrong word. By working with the suffering and reducing it, we automatically give space for the happiness and the joy to come up with. Any comments on that, Phil?
I think that's a great description. You know, why are we happy? We're happy because of something we have that we view as being good, and we're happy because we don't have something we don't think is good. So, you know, happiness and suffering are maybe just flip side of the coin. And
Yeah.
it's a whole topic unto itself, which we'll address in the
Yeah.
future. But
Yeah.
the issue is simply, what is happiness? How is it defined? Is it really contentment we want rather than happiness? And is it really meaning that is as important or more important than happiness? So
there's another comment and question here, Phil,
Oh.
but I'll just, the essence of it, what sometimes it seems suffering is not always optional.
Mm-hmm.
There can be a lot of emotional pain. And what if the pain were to never cease? So for example, at pain clinics, for sure, there are certain kinds of pain that you can't mindfully meditate your way out of. And this is where medication may come in. But in the realms of suffering psychologically, we can always, with emotional, psychological, spiritual pain, we can always look at our relationship. And that's a whole conversation on its own. That's a whole talk. I think, Phil, I just sent you the learning objectives for a talk I'm giving in a couple of months on how to be with grief. So this is a good lead in and a good point to wrap up. I'm aware of the time. And this is exactly it. How can we change our relationship to that emotional pain that always seems to be grabbing us? So the presentation and talk I'll be giving will be addressing that. So please come back, the person who posted that. Phil, I want to thank you so much. Always a pleasure. I've heard you speak many times, and every time you bring your heart, you bring your vulnerability, you demonstrate your personal continued wrestling with this material. I think that's important because we're continually learning to become comfortable feeling uncomfortable. You bring another angle, you frame something differently, and it's always a pleasure to be part of this. I'll also note, Phil, that the vast majority of people have actually stayed 2 minutes past time, because on Zoom it's easy to drop out and you often only have 3 people hanging on at the end, but you've kept the audience raptured. And Maya just posted, can you sign up for the next talk in March? The websites are there. Maya mentioned them earlier on. You can find it through our websites. There it is. Once again, Phil, thank you so much for all of this. Thank you, Maya, and the folks at the library. Please pass on our thanks and gratitude for the opportunity to share an hour and a half. And my dog Caramel has just walked in. Hello, Sunshine. Thank you. And you may have a word. And again, if you are so inclined, please, a small donation on the website would be much appreciated. Literally, even if it's $5, much appreciated.